Welcome to the Local Fit Show. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon. Each week, we bring you the best insights in nutrition, mental health, habit building, training, and more. This week, I'm joined by Rick, our mental health therapist, to talk about alcoholism. Enjoy the show. We talk a lot on this podcast and just as a team in general about how to incorporate alcohol like in a fitness sense, right? And that sounds really counterproductive, right? And I think a lot of people listening, if you've listened to our content before, this is your first time, you'd be like, whoa, this feels like a lot of conflicting views. But as a brief summary, in the fitness space, a lot of people, it feels like, oh my gosh, I could never have a drink again if I ever want to be like a healthy person. Or, all these people who have these great physiques and great bodies never drink alcohol. And that's just not true, right? Like, obviously, there's a point where I'm not ever going to say that drinking alcohol is healthy. It is a toxin. So there is nothing that is healthy about this. But in the name of diet flexibility, which is what our team is basically built off of, having a drink every once in a while, being social, is totally acceptable within a program. But obviously, like with anything, there is a point where it isn't okay. It's not just about, I can have a few drinks every once in a while. It becomes a true issue. So we had a question sent in about alcoholism, which I thought was a really, really great question. And it covers a lot of things. And we looked at this and you were like, this isn't just about alcoholism. Like you could insert any maybe negative behavior here,
sure,
right?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things we could interchange. So I think even if you're listening, you're like, I don't really give a shit about alcoholism. I don't have that. I don't know anybody with it. One, chances are you might at some point know someone with it, right? So we're going to go over kind of a brief just addiction / alcoholism talk and then also answer this question. But I do think that it's applicable to so many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great things about the question, the person who wrote it in, is that you can take out the alcoholism piece. And there's so many relational components to the issues and the struggles that this particular person's faced with that everybody can relate to. And the reality is, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't been impacted in some way, shape, or form by addiction in their life, be it a family member themselves or somebody that they know, friend, colleague, whatever. So it's a far-reaching topic that even if it's not in your immediacy, you've definitely dealt with this at some point in your life or it's been an impact in your life.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate, obviously, and we want to touch on this because we touch on, I feel like, a lot of the just random topics, but things that people are interested in, and we can actually do a deep dive. So I'm going to read the question, and then we're going to go kind of in a general sense. So I'd like to hear you and Rick talk about alcoholism, and okay. I'm literally reading the paper, and I messed it up. Okay. I'd like to hear you and Rick talk about what alcoholism is and how it affects the people surrounding the person. I have been in a relationship with someone who has been not so much struggling because they don't seem to want to stop, but more like self-medicating with it for around 6 years off and on, with the last 2 years of our relationship being long distance. It makes a person super mean to be around them. I'd consider it verbally abusive and brings out suicidal ideation sometimes. We've had so many fights and conversations about it, brought a counselor into the mix once, and it was always changes for the very short term before it creeps back in again. It starts with, why can't I just have one beer at dinner? I'm fine, it's no big deal, and ends with a few weeks later with binges on weekdays or multiple a week. I guess what I want to know is when to give up. I know I can't fix them, but they were making good progress on their own before I decided to move. I made some huge life changes to be with this person because of how well they had been doing for months before I decided to make those changes, and they were set in stone. But as I'm writing this, the issue has come back into play after being around each other again only for 1 month. I can't take this again. So there's a lot going on here. And like we said, this is partly about alcoholism and it's partly about relationship. Like this person said, when is time to give up? So there's a lot that we can cover here. But first, let's touch on just addiction and alcoholism in general.
Yeah. So whoever wrote that question, first and foremost, thank you for sharing that with us and opening up. It's never easy to write about these things, and I think that's where the anonymous part of this helps people.
Certainly.
So thank you for sharing it, because I can promise you, as a therapist who's been doing this for a while, this is not the first time I've seen this scenario or this similar experiences or situations, and I assure you that somebody else listening to this is more than likely going through the same thing. So I want to talk about what is addiction, and we'll give a high overview of what addiction is, what it kind of looks like, and then we'll start to move into some specifics as it relates to exercise, diet, fitness, your health, and then kind of break down the question and things that we want to include. So if you've listened to me on this podcast before, you've heard me talk about the phrase, right? The addiction is causing clinically significant impairment in the individual's social, occupational, or personal life, right? So what does that actually mean? Let's break that down. Clinically significant impairment is basically a way of saying, is it causing problems? And are they causing significant problems? Not just a little thing, but significant problems in a person's social life. Like, are you changing friends? Are you not going out as much? Are you not participating in the things that you used to love to do because you're now drinking more or you don't have the energy to do them? Occupational. Are you showing up late? Are you missing work? Are you missing deadlines? Is your performance dropping? Are you getting into more arguments and having difficulty managing time and things like that? You know, these are all pretty typical, obvious signs that a person's struggling. Personal life. Your interpersonal relationships. Is this affecting your romantic relationships? Is it affecting the relationships with your kids, with your children, with other members of your family? Like, are you withdrawing from things? Are you not around family members as much as you used to because you're drinking more? Are people being critical? Are they kind of walking on eggshells around you? All of these things are telltale signs that there are problems occurring. One of the things that I do as a clinician is I always stay away from diagnosing or calling somebody an addict, because an addict has a lot of negative connotations to it, and it's just got a really negative stigma. Personally, no one wants to be called an addict, even if they're like strung out on coke, like, or heroin addict, you know what I mean? Like, they're just like, I don't want to be an addict. Like, I can be anything but an addict. And so one of the ways, you know, I try and go about it is I take that definition and I kind of start looking at the person's entire life, their social, their occupational, their interpersonal relationships. And I hope to try and get the person to be like, do you think that your drinking is causing problems in these areas? And if they can admit that there's a problem, at least, like, yes, I think my drinking or my drug use or something that's going on in my life is causing some problems in these areas, then we have a place to start. Otherwise, I know you're stuck in pre-contemplation, you're in complete denial, you're not willing to go there yet. And so the road becomes more difficult in terms of, I can't do anything else until we can break that first barrier, until you can at least be like, yeah, there's something going on here. I might not know how to change. I might not want to change, but at least I can admit that there's something going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I feel like the label of addict too can then be something that people kind of fall back on, like, oh, well, it's because I'm an addict, right? Like, you see that happening too. Like, this label is something that kind of follows them wherever, and maybe it's not alcohol anymore, but you're like, oh, because you always hear like, once an addict, always an addict, which to some degree I think rings true, but some degree not, right? Mm-hmm. But like, I think if you kind of hear that over and over again, and you're like, oh, well, I'm an addict, and I've been an addict, and everybody in my family has addiction problems, so like, I replace this with another thing, so that label kind of follows you. So I feel like it would be detrimental even afterwards too.
Yeah, it can, because this becomes the only lens that people want to see you through.
Yeah, or yourself. Like, you're like, I have an addictive personality. It's like, well, I mean, most people have an addictive personality when we're like changing your dopamine threshold. Like nobody is like immune to that. So if you do something long enough that is that provoking, like, you're gonna, like, it's not you specifically. Like, certainly, like, addiction runs in families and there's behavioral things there. And
some people, like, not the other side of that is, some people are like, yes, I am an addict, and I know that, and they use it as a boundary to gauge and keep themselves safe. So
there's a lot of
what one works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. But for me, what I'm trying to create in the person is awareness. And if I call them an addict and it shuts them down, I didn't help create any awareness. And if they can look at themselves and become aware consciously within themselves and say, yes, I have a problem with this, or yeah, this has caused an issue and I might be an addict, and they can get to that space on their own, you know, then there's something to really work with. We can work with whatever the structure is that is going to benefit them in recovery and for the rest of their life. And so to kind of go right into what you were talking about, like, what is one drink? What is that? And here's the complexity of it, right? Because one person's manageable habit or personal freedom may seem like chronic drug abuse or substance abuse to somebody else. So where does the line get drawn? And I think this is where a lot of people are always looking for. And I have conversations like when I do classes or seminars, and I'm like, all right, guys, how many drinks, you know, like, how many licks to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop is it? You know what I mean? And I'm like, okay, how many drinks per week do you think it would qualify as a problem? You know, and you get everything from 1 to like 10. And you're like, okay, is there, like, what qualifies that? Like, so the person who has one drink a week, like, explain why that's a problem. And usually you start getting into their own personal biases as it relates to it. But again, my measure of it is against saying, all right, this person says 1 or 10, whatever the number is this causing problems in the following areas? You know, are you unhappy with it? Is this an element of your life that you want to change? It might not even be causing problems, but it might be something you want to change. You might be like, I think I drink too much. I don't want to drink, or I don't understand, like, I can pay my bills, I'm a good husband or wife, I can do these things, but I still find myself reaching for the bottle, or I find myself using or relying on marijuana too much to calm my anxiety. It can be a self-motivated reason. It doesn't have to be because there's always problems. It could just be an element of you that you want to change. And so what's the ceiling? I don't know. It depends on the individual. I kind of liken it to, and maybe you'll shit on this, maybe you won't, I don't know. But it's kind of like a cheat meal, right? If I'm clean and eating 30 quality meals in a row, like, is it okay for me to go pick out at McDonald's once? Like, probably. There's no real harm in that. But if I eat McDonald's every single day, it becomes more problematic, right? And so it's kind of the same thing with alcohol. Is there a health benefit to it? Look, I'm not going to get into the glass of wine and all that kind of crap a day.
Spoiler alert. The amount of resveratrol that you would get from a glass of wine has, like, there is benefits, like research benefits for, like, with resveratrol, but the amount that you need would be, like, I think it's something astronomical. It's like, it's so many, it's like multiple bottles, if not it's not even feasible, basically. So you might as well just, if you want the benefits of that, because you particularly think that that's useful, then you should just take that supplement. You're not going to get it from 2 glasses of wine.
No.
Like,
I think that was a clever marketing person, like, way back in the day who,
of course,
like, a glass of wine will help you. And it's like,
you're like, just because this research came out with, like, 200 times the dose, you know, like, that's kind of not the same thing.
Yeah.
But hey, you know, so are there health benefits? I mean,
no,
there's not. There are obvious health detriments, right? But it's kind of like anything. In the context of a healthy diet and lifestyle, can you offset some of those negatives? Yes. But it would be like somebody who, like, you know, there's too much of anything. But if you're somebody who, like, resistance trains, does aerobic activity, like, keeps your weight in check, you know, it has a great handle on the rest of your diet, has a solid body composition, you have really no other health markers that are, you know, out of control. If you have a few drinks, like, is that a bad thing? Might not be, you know, like, it's certainly probably, again, not going to help you, but it might not harm you that much. But everything else has to be in context too. Like, it's not a, like, you can't just look at that in a vacuum. Like, is alcohol healthy? Absolutely not. It's trash for your body. Like, it's legitimately toxic. Yeah. But in the context of everything else, it's kind of like the same thing. Like, am I going to see, like, I'm not going to say, like, oh yeah, chocolate cake is, like, really good for you. It's obviously not. But can you have chocolate cake in the context of a healthy diet and lifestyle? Yeah. Just like anything, no matter what, take any food that could be deemed healthy, right? Like chicken breast. Okay. How much is too much chicken breast, right? Like, there's such thing as too much chicken breast. Like, so it's the same thing with having something that's like a negative and a positive.
Too much chicken breast.
Listen, there's definitely
a phrase I've never heard before.
Trust me, there is a fucking limit to chicken, especially. First of all, it gets gross as fuck after a while, but also, like, like, it's just like, oh,
you need something else.
Yeah, but also, like, people do develop a lot of sensitivities to poultry, I find.
Yeah.
Anyways, tangent. Surprise!
So
pretty much have chicken breast with your wine is what we're saying.
Yeah.
We're done with the podcast.
Stay super healthy. There's no, that's the complexity of the issue is that nothing is ever really black or white. And it's not a healthy thing, but if done in moderation and on occasion, it's not going to cause any real detrimental effect. For each person, it's going to be different. Like, if you're a person that has one drink and turns into belligerent drunk, like, it's going to be different versus the person who might be able to have 3 or 4 and no real negative side effects come out of that. And they can enjoy their Saturday night, or they can come home on a Wednesday and crack open a beer and nothing is there. Some of you might be wondering, like, well, why is it one person can do that and the other one can't? For a variety of factors that none of which I could 100% put my finger on. It could be your childhood, your experiences with it, your metabolism, what you ate, what you slept. There's 1,000 factors that go into this. How your body processes and metabolizes alcohol, like it's just
a huge part of it.
It's just endless. And so the idea of it is not to just, is to, when you start looking at it in terms of, well, why can't I have one beer? Or why, you know, or why can't I have one beer when you can have one beer? It's not fair. And you start looking at it in terms of like fairness. It's like, okay, we're venturing down the irrational rabbit hole now. Instead of accepting it is for what it is. And what I think is we've also been sold a ton of myths on alcohol and our ability to have fun around it and how difficult it is to even quit. When you start challenging some of those status quos even, you start to open up different ideas and complexities. And maybe that's a whole separate podcast. We'll go down that rabbit hole later in challenging some of the things and beliefs that we even have about addiction and recovery.
Or just like challenging, like just kind of those common beliefs that we hear about stuff. But yeah, I mean,
why can't I be 6'7"? Like, well, Rick, for a lot of reasons, it's just life. Sometimes you can't predict those things. Like, if you're the person who can't have one drink because one turns into 100 and you turn into a really bad person or somebody that people don't want to be around, like, why doesn't really matter anymore. It just is. That's your height, that's your color, that's your frame. This is a crutch that you've got to deal with. And the longer you hold on to these, like, why not me? Why can't this? Why?
Fair.
You're just delaying healing. You're delaying a new process, a new recovery from setting in, and it's just going to be longer. So hold on to it for as long as you want, whatever rationalizations you have, but understand that once you learn to accept the reality of who you are and your limitations, or what alcohol does to you, the better off you'll be, and the sooner you can start to turn your life around. There's two main components to addiction for most people. There's a physical addiction and a psychological addiction. Physical addiction is dependency arises as the user's body literally adapts to repeated uses of drugs or alcohol. The process is usually called building a tolerance. We've all heard of this, right? And this is where you need to continually increase the amount that you're taking to either continue to get to the same level of high or just maintain, period. Tolerance is very normal and typical with sustained chronic drug or drinking use. Psychological dependency is a little bit different, and to me this is the one that is more difficult to actually overcome, which refers to the belief that a person cannot cope without the drug or the alcohol. And so for some people it's kind of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Generally speaking, it's the psychological dependency that develops first before the physical one, because you seek out substances as a way to cope with something else that's happening in your life. Now, sometimes it's totally accidental. You stumble into it, you're like, hey, I'm gonna have a drink. You try it for the first time and down the rabbit hole we go. Like there wasn't anything other than maybe curiosity, but it got its grips on you, it got its hooks in, and now we're down the rabbit hole. And so yes, for me, when I have a client who's physically addicted and psychologically addicted, the first thing I need to cure is the physical addiction. Sometimes that means detox and withdrawal and all that kind of stuff, because I can't get the mind to focus on something and learn new things if it's craving and jonesing for something else. And generally speaking, most detox, within 2 weeks, you're done. 30 days at a max. Like if you were to check yourself into a detox, like it's out of your system, you're no longer craving it, you're not like climbing the walls for like 6 months, like nope, that's all crap. 2 weeks, it's out of your body and you're usually doing well. Like 2 weeks to 30 days is the timeline to get rid of physical addiction to the point where your body's no longer craving it. Now you've got to start addressing the psychological addiction.
You might still be craving it, but from that psychological
From the psychological perspective, right? I'm stressed, I want to drink. I'm angry, I want to drink. I'm happy, I want to drink.
Yeah, it becomes a behavior. I think that's where, especially with alcohol, because it's so socially accepted. I mean, obviously other drugs are becoming much more socially acceptable as well. But I think that especially alcohol is one of those things that it's like, no matter what kind of mood, like you said, it can even be, I think a lot of people think of alcoholism as like, oh, I can't go without this. Like I'm really struggling. Like I really need this. Or it could just still be something that is a behavior that you fall into, like when you're being social or in a good mood. Some people do that with obviously, cigarettes or weed or whatever it is. Right. And it's not necessarily always like a bad reason that you started drinking a lot, but it becomes a habit. Oh, every time I'm doing this, or every time I have like this paper I have to write, I drink. Or every time I have this going on. Well, then what if that behavior like upticks, right? What if you are no longer doing whatever? Like I know, you know, when the school shut down for a little bit, like for those few weeks when COVID first hit, I was used to like, okay, I go to jujitsu these nights.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm not going to drink on those nights. And then, well, clearly that was a whole different situation because everything was kind of shut down for a few weeks. And it was like, oh, well, I'll just have wine because I'm at home. I'm like, it's a behavior. Like I'm done with work. I'll just have wine because I enjoy wine. Okay. Oh, I bought this ice cream too. Like, let me have that. And then I'm like, a fucking few weeks in, like, holy shit, I've had like ice cream and wine every night. Like probably not the best look, not the best move. And it wasn't because I was seeking it out. It was just because that behavior was there. Like if I don't do X, then I'm going to do Y.
Right.
And it was
a change in your routine created new habits, new routines.
Yeah. It's so crazy. Yeah. And like, it wasn't anything like, oh man, I just got to have a drink right now. It was just.
And I think for a lot of people, that's part of the accidental addiction that occurs. Like it's involuntary.
Anything, even behaviors.
Yeah.
Like video games. When I get home from work, I want to play a video game or whatever.
I want to escape or detach for a few minutes and relax.
I mean, just go on my phone. And then you look up in an hour and you're like, fuck.
All the Instagram, you know, reels that just keep coming up. Like you're like, yeah, you're down the rabbit hole.
Ever and ever. And then you're like, wait. And then you're like, oh my god, what am I looking at? Like
every time I get sick of it, and I'm like, this is crap. And then I swipe up the next one, and I'm like, oh, this is the one that I was looking for.
Damn it. It's like
they got me.
They knew.
They knew.
They so knew.
Assholes. So yeah,
like a little avatar, the social dilemma. Like, do you remember that? Like they like made that thing. Wasn't it social dilemma? They had that. It was like a fake thing, but like it was like they were pretending like they had this avatar, and they were like, "Oh, didn't get enough likes here. Better go ping like this and create a notification." Yes. And then the avatar was like, "Oh shit!"
Behind work.
Like Rick wanted to leave. No, show him
quick
this
jujitsu video. Quick comedy, jujitsu comedy. He's back.
He's back. He's hooked. Got another 20 minutes on this guy.
Pretty much. I can be programmed. I won't lie.
Everybody can.
So that's addiction in a nutshell. And yeah, it can be involuntary. I think one of the big issues that we're facing with now is with the opioid epidemic. When people are getting pain medications, accidental addiction is so common because they're being prescribed, they're in a lot of pain. And because these things are so addictive, like they can stumble into it. And so you said an interesting thing as you were just kind of like going down, like you were processing through it. You know, a lot of times people will say to themselves, like, I need this. And it caught my ear when you said it. Because one of the first things I start to do is challenge people on the language that they're using. Like, you don't need this, you want this. There's a difference between those two things. Like, need is an element of survival. This is not about survival. But by telling myself I need it, it becomes that critical to me. It becomes so important that it's like, everything else can fade away because I need this. And so in your mind, you're relating it to that like threshold of survival. Like it's so important to you instead of saying, I want this. And when you can start to change that language and challenge it in your mind, that's when you start to say like, all right, I don't act like I know that I want it, but I don't really want it. So what can I do? What are my skills? What are the things that I've got put in place? Like, how do I manage this? The cravings, the urges, all that kind of stuff. And once I get a person thinking like that, like the recovery starts to grow exponentially because they can catch themselves and they're becoming their own therapist in the moment, not in terms of like gaining super amounts of insight, but they're able to catch. And that's the goal, right? Like I'm not going to like, I can't hold your hand all day. The same way a fitness coach doesn't like monitor every meal that you have. Like I can't do that. I can tell you what to do. It's up to you to go do it. And so that's what we're really striving for at that point. But one of the things that I do want to start to get into is the effect that addiction has.
I'm having like a fucking super OCD moment.
Okay.
Okay, it's gone.
I was like, is she going to walk out of the room and you just wanted to make sure the camera was on? Awesome.
I was like, that was a really good part. I'm gonna write down that like time stamp, and then I was like, is the camera on?
For those of you on YouTube.
No, we're definitely
Please pause.
Edit this shit.
No, leave it in.
No.
People will love it.
Oh
I'm telling you.
Why am I like this?
It adds the human element to it.
I literally was driving somewhere the other day and I had to pull over because I thought I forgot something. Like that's how I was like reeling over the fact that I thought that I left something. I almost surrendered. Like,
Was it an important thing that you thought that you
I don't even remember now, so no. But
okay. And we're back.
And we're back.
Well, I am. Lauren's not. Lauren's anxiety needs to calm down.
I am like teetering off the cliff, and it could go either way.
So
I might need a drink. Let's
bring some wine while we're talking about addiction. Good call, Lauren.
I'm joking.
Come on, your listeners know.
I'm like, no.
They know you're not joking.
Okay, keep fucking going.
All right. So the impact that addiction can have on the family. And this is where I think a big part of the question that came into me spoke to me. And this is the part that I did want to spend a significant amount of time talking about. Because oftentimes when we think about addiction, our focus narrows in on the person with the problem. And what ends up happening is everything else and everyone else gets ignored because we're dedicating so much of our time to fixing the problem or the person. And that we don't understand or we minimize the impact that the addict has or the addicted person has on everybody else, and the relationship issues and the self-esteem issues and the toxicity and the problems that get created. It's this huge ripple effect. It doesn't just touch one person, it touches the entire family. And so what I want people to understand is what I'm about to tell you, these like kind of traits and characteristics, it's not just with addiction. This is with any person who has like, or any family that struggles with like any type of compulsive behavior, right? Like if you grow up in a home that has like strict religious boundaries, or a person who struggles with gambling or drug abuse or overeating, like it goes on and on. Like that's what I'm saying. You can almost take alcoholism out of this and you can put in and insert like almost any unhealthy behavior and the same impact will happen. So one of the things that I want to highlight is this. Addiction can be almost, if not the same or more dangerous to the rest of the family as it is the addict. And the reason I say that is this, because people struggle to see from the family's perspective. So when you take a person who's abusing substances in some way, shape, or form, oftentimes that person, the addict, is numb to the world. So they're going through these experiences numb. They're actively numbing them out. However, the rest of the family is sober and feeling everything. And that gets so lost because it is not acknowledged, it isn't validated, and no one understands that unless you're in that family. It is so hard for people to grasp that concept, that I've been ignored, that I've been underappreciated, that no one has spent any time or effort or energy. Nothing of that has gone into me because we've only been focusing on that. And it's not just the brother or the sister, it's the mom, the dad, the husband, the wife, like everybody, the grandparents, the cousins, whoever is in that family.
It's kind of like the narcissist, almost different, but where they're not necessarily maybe feeling the negative effects, but like everybody else is, right? So they're maybe not so numb to it, but they're just completely detached from even recognizing it. In this situation,
yes.
They're very numb to their choices, obviously, until they're sober. But even then, they probably just continue to numb in other ways, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so you're right. Like nobody ever really does think about that, and that's what that question points to so well. I think is that this person clearly is feeling all of those effects, and it's kind of like, what do I do?
They're
like,
just confused and lost, and like they're at a point where I feel they genuinely don't know what to do. Do I stay? Do I go? Like, if I stay, how long do I stay? Like, what changes should I see? You know, what are all the signs? If I go, what does that look like? Like, it becomes overwhelming for people, and so sometimes that's what causes the standstill, is they just don't know what to do.
It's like with any behavior change, though, right? I mean, that's a huge hurdle for most people, is just feeling that like freeze, right? Like it's not like fight or flight; you're just like legit just frozen.
The fight, flight, or freeze. You just stay stuck in it because you don't know what to do. And our mind, being logical and rational, is always able to do the pro-con list, like the pros of leaving, the pros of staying, the cons of leaving, the cons of staying. You know what I mean? And so, at the end of the day, unless it's like glaringly obvious and you tend to lean more toward the logical side of things and you're less emotional, sure, you can make that. But the majority of people, like their intimate relationships have such a strong emotional component to them that logic doesn't necessarily work. In fact, logically, we might know this isn't the right thing for me, but emotionally, I still feel compelled to stay. And so I think because the addict is numb and we're sober and aware of everything that's going on in our lives, it becomes very difficult for the rest of the family to watch that other person change and sometimes become a person that we are afraid of and we have a deep amount of fear for. Not only fear of like them dying, but of them hurting us, and all the other atrocities that come with addiction and everything that could, bring about. And so, I brought up death, which is a component of it. It doesn't seem like in this particular scenario, the person's at a space where they're going to die or it's causing life-threatening ailments.
Well,
assuming they're not like drinking and driving and things like that.
I mean, suicidal ideation.
Suicidal ideation.
But that's different. That's not dying from alcohol necessarily.
We've been around people who are drunk and they're like, I just don't want to live any, and the depression kicks in. What I always try and explain to people is that oftentimes alcohol will amplify whatever it is you're already thinking and feeling, right? It's just a megaphone. So like if you're super happy and lovey, you're like, oh my God, I fucking love you, man. Or if they're already kind of sad and whatever they're feeling before they drink, that's when you see the depressed, like, I don't want to live anymore. This just sucks. Like life sucks. And so it's this amplification of what the person's already feeling in whatever mental state they're already in. And that can be a lot to be around because we've all had people who are like that. And you're like, I don't want to drink around them. Like they just get too bummed and it's like, God, it's such a buzzkill. But what I do want to talk about is the impact of a person who drinks and is depressed, and especially with like the suicidal ideation part, is what ends up happening to the rest of the family is I want you guys to think about what it would be like if every night you went to bed thinking that this person is going to die, or that the expectation is that if this continues, they're going to die, meaning death is a certainty in their mind. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen. What do you think the psychological toll is that takes on a person or a family, right? It can start with just anxiety and then move into generalized anxiety. And then it can turn into chronic depression, right? It can turn into suicidal thoughts of your own. It can turn into self-harming behaviors on your own. Because what also ends up happening is the people around them go so numb to the rest of the terrifying events that continue to happen. And it's like things that are supposed to provoke fear just become normalized to a degree. And it's not scary anymore because it's just what's expected. And when that starts to happen, like your version of normal is completely skewed from everybody else's who's not living in that chaos. And so this is where it starts to alter relationships and our perception of them and what's healthy and unhealthy.
And that level is going to be different just anyway too, with like what somebody's coming in with, like their baseline, what they grew up with, like what was normal. Like because for somebody who maybe didn't grow up around anybody who drank, like going into a situation like this might seem like really jarring. Whereas somebody else who grew up with the family that drank a lot, you're like, oh, this is kind of normal. Kind of happens off and on. Saw this growing up, whatever. So I feel like there's so much there. But this unfortunately sounds like this is kind of being used as a coping mechanism, and then the partner is just like kind of stuck, like what do we do, because I don't feel like I'm getting through. And that probably just sounds like they're in that beginning part of like the change, or they're not ready to change because they're not aware really of the ramifications, and they're saying things like, why can't I just have one? Like there's
trying to justify the use.
There's no big deal, like I don't have a problem. And I feel like that's probably one of the more common things, especially if it's not, and I hate to say this, I'll put this in quotes, too bad, right? Like if it's not that they're not functioning, like they're kind of like, maybe they're not functioning optimally, but it's not like, they lost their job or they have no friends anymore or this or that.
The
like
functional alcoholic?
Yeah. So in
my
this
favorite phrase.
In that sense, they might be like, there's no issue. Like, I'm fine.
And you,
and to your point,
for it?
There's no number though. That's what is appropriate. Like, what is a binge? What is a bender? Like, I mean, I think we can all agree on the extreme ends, like what a bender is. Like we all have probably done that multiple times, but I think we all know, like, oh wow, that was like a lot. Like probably having 10 drinks in a night was not the norm, right? But did you do that once in 3 years, or was that like, okay, like that's multiple times a week?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've had like a couple, right? And they'll be sitting in my office and you'll hear the dialogue and you'll hear the one person say, well, I pay the bills, I go to work, I get up on time, I go to the kids' stuff. Like, what's the problem? And so they're looking for that, like, there's no detriment. And I'm going, well, the problem is sitting right next to you. They're unhappy. Like, you can't say that there's no problem if the person sitting next to you who you've chosen to spend your life with is upset with your drinking and drug use. There's one of the problems, right? And so it's like it's confronting that space, and it's like, is the problem this person who's drinking? Maybe. Is it maybe you? Is your expectation of what drinking is and what they should be doing the problem? Because maybe they're okay, and maybe it's not as bad as you think. And so it's not about judging it, but it's also about like, okay, are you just trying to pinpoint like, all right, because I'm doing these other things, it justifies my drinking? And so I always try and look at it from multiple perspectives and never just to jump down the person's throat and be like, okay, because you're drinking, this is a problem. It's not. Like, we have to look at it in context of everything. But oftentimes the person sitting next to you is like, hey, their drinking is a problem, so you can't tell me that there's no problems in your life being caused by drinking. And in fact, I believe I said personal life was one of the problem areas that we focus on.
like per my notes.
Yeah.
Per my last email.
Per my notes in the DSM. So one thing that is equally important to understand is this, because we're going to start getting into the psychology or the psychological components of what growing up in a family does when they have somebody who's an addict. Is one of the things that starts to happen is a person starts to question themselves, like, what do my emotions even matter when somebody else's life is at stake? So if I'm the brother and my sister is the addict, and mom and dad and me are always trying to help my sister, the addiction component gets, like, in our minds, it gets brought down to the space, because we're just talking about dying, about survival, right? And so if we're worrying about whether or not this person is going to live and die, me feeling sad or lonely is very easy to dismiss. And in fact, sometimes families will be like, how dare you express yourself right now? Your brother or your sister is like struggling right now, and you're talking about being upset from school. Like, grow up. And all of a sudden what you realize is we're silencing this person. We're not validating him. There's no room for anybody else to exist. So when you talked about, like, yeah, the narcissistic component, like how it affects everybody else, this is what it does. It shuts everybody else down. You don't matter because you're not life and death. And your feelings don't matter because they're not as important as this. Like, what's more important than somebody living or dying? Nothing. That's it. Like, at a fundamental level, like, all other choices go out the window. You live or you die. Nothing is more important than those decisions. And so in our minds, it gets to that space. And so anything else that isn't life or death just doesn't rate, which means I don't rate. I don't matter. My feelings don't matter. My thoughts, my hopes, my dreams, my fears, my anger doesn't matter. And no one cares, because it's not about, I'm not dying. And I'm just get ignored for doing everything right, or mostly doing everything right, and just trying to survive and get no acknowledgement, no validation. None of the support goes into developing me as a person. I just learned to survive. So
Yeah. Do you think that that has something to do with like kind of that generational, like addiction cycle? Like, do you think that that would maybe create, like, say, like your brother is dealing with some kind of substance abuse, and then like now you have not integrated anything over here because you've been ignored and all those things you were saying. Do you think that that, like, I don't know, is there any
it
research
plays out
to
in
show?
your
Yeah.
next relationship.
Yeah, like, does that have that effect?
Yeah,
Basically, in a
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
like that domino effect. Like, because I was ignored here in all these ways, now I created similar or sort of similar problems to the actual person, like to my, in that situation, that brother.
Absolutely. Which is where we see the patterns repeat. And oftentimes the patterns repeat because they're familiar to us, or we're also subconsciously looking to resolve the issue. And so, like, if I couldn't fix my brother, but I find another romantic relationship where he's an addict and I can get him to quit, it somehow
That's so
cathartically
toxic. Oh my gosh.
saves my brother and the relationship, and I'm now made whole because I finally saved somebody. And we're going to get into rescuer and all that kind of stuff. But it's when one person sucks all the love, all the energy, all the worry, the strength, the effort, the attention, it all gets pulled into one person. There's nothing left for anybody else in the family. And that's where it starts to develop. We start to develop as survivors in that space, like that kind of stoic mindset. Sometimes what you tend to see is people will start to say, all right, I don't exist in this family, so I become anonymous. My thoughts, my feelings, everything, like I'm not going to talk about how I feel. I'm not going to share my thoughts. I'm not going to talk about my hopes or my dreams or anything else because there's no room for it. No one cares. There's no room to, like, how do you have hopes and dreams and who knows about them? Is because people ask you and they create an environment for you to think beyond life and death and allow those things to occur and talk about it and process it. So you start to shut down. You become like, I'm not going to talk about these things because I don't exist anywhere. There's no need for it. Right?
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so people learn to shut down.
So toxic.
Mm-hmm. They don't matter. What matters is everybody else. And this is where codependency starts to root. Right? I can't focus on myself, so I'm going to focus on all the problems for everybody else in my life. And now I don't have to deal with me either.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, because you're like, oh, I don't matter, so
yeah.
I don't need to deal with my issues. Oh, damn.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
so deep.
Some other things that I just want to kind of touch on, and we'll kind of run through these. If you hear one that you want to make a comment on, just kind of jump in because I don't want to spend too much time on all this. But this is like kind of like as these things happen, this is how the psychology of an individual gets shaped living in environments where there's an addict. Number one, people have a hard time understanding what a healthy family actually looks like. If you grow up in an environment where it's chaotic, you don't know what healthy is, so you're left kind of guessing at what healthy is, or worse, sometimes using that template to gauge what healthy is. And sometimes people struggle with understanding the differences between what's a good role model and what's a bad role model. Because if one of the addicts was your parents, right, who's the template and the basis for all future relationships, for your perception and development of yourself, this is what's normal to me, right? And so when does that person learn? This is where all the other factors of that person's life matter, right? Personal note on my own history, my father was an alcoholic. Right. So how did I know what healthy behavior was? Well, I had an amazing mother, right? I had a great sister, but I also had other family members. I had uncles and like my best friend's father. These were all healthy people in my life who fulfilled that role. And so I was like, okay, this is what a man's supposed to look like. This is what responsibility is supposed to look like. This is what accountability looks like. This is what love and compassion and all the other things that were missing that I was desperately looking for in him, couldn't get, but these people provided. And so, like, I was fortunate in that sense. But this is why I always tell people never underestimate the impact you'll have in somebody else's life, because you could be that friend of the family member or whoever.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This is so like just over. I'm like thinking of so many, so many things, so many situations. I'm just like reeling, and like it really is. It's so easy for things to degenerate, like with one person's behavior, and like how that affects everybody in their immediate surroundings. And it makes sense why there's so many like fucked up people, right? Like, because everybody like if anybody here is reflecting, like, unless your family's perfect, which like I don't like.
There isn't a perfect
I don't
family.
think there's ever like that's not a thing, and nobody should be expected to be. But in this instance, there are so many behaviors or substances that are just people have problems with, and like how that ripple effect is going to influence you. And like you said, at some point finding, you really need to find some type of outside influence, whether it is like other family members or friends or coaches or just mentors, like people in your life who like show you what is like possible, and then also like what is healthy. But I bet that would be really hard because your lens is so tainted, right? Because you're like, you could probably see like a healthy relationship, but not even really be able to like understand like, oh, like, is this really Or is this just like you might not even really recognize that it is healthy because you might still be stuck
Right.
thinking that that is still sort of normal. Like, you know, it's not right, but you're like, that's not that bad.
Mm-hmm. But in order for you to learn something new, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So even if it's just observing, like what healthy looks like.
No, I'm just saying. I feel like that was probably one of the hurdles, though.
It is.
Because
Oh yeah,
people
absolutely.
are like, oh no, this is pretty normal.
Yeah.
Like, I know it's a little fucked up, but like it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And then they see something that is really healthy, and they're like, I don't really know about that. Like, is that good? Is that fake? Is that like they're just second guessing that? Like, that doesn't look real.
It might not be, and it might. Yeah.
That could also be fake. So double check. Like, do some background check on that. That other source.
Yeah. But I think by and large, once you start identifying what healthy is, you can start to see it, and then you can start to I don't know, counterbalance it against what you lived through, what your personal experiences were, and then that's where real change and insight grow. Another thing is people being hard on themselves, or they find it difficult or challenging to really relax. Oftentimes, yeah, Lauren.
Like, I just leave.
Some of this, I'm sure you're going to be like, oh, is he talking about me? Oftentimes, people in these environments focus on overcorrecting. So they develop this kind of perfectionistic outlook to avoid feeling like a failure. And they do this, but regardless of the results, it never satisfies that piece. You just move on to the next thing. And so what we also see is identity issues. They often struggle with who they are when they aren't doing something or working toward a task. Number 3 is kind of like building trust issues. This is imperative for all future relationships. They make it difficult to establish close and intimate relationships because we can't develop trust. Well, why does that actually occur? Well, we find it hard to trust other people because what we're afraid of is that somebody is going to hurt and betray us again, the way our parents' unhealthy, toxic behavior did. And so deep in our minds, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, when is this person going to betray us? When are they going to let us down? And if we go into the relationship with those assumptions, like, I never fully trust you, I never open up. Because deep down inside, the people who were supposed to love me the most betrayed me and hurt me. And so we carry that with us. And so this is like what we're talking about, baggage and old trauma and old history. Carrying with you, this is exactly what we're talking about. And it's always scary to trust somebody. Even if you're like a really trusting person, you're going to get hurt sooner or later by somebody. They're going to let you down. They're going to disappoint you. And it's understanding that human beings are fallible and we need to be able to pick ourselves up from that and forgive them. Forgiveness is a big key for the family in recovery, believe it or not, which is fucked up because they're like, why do I have to forgive them? It's like sometimes you got to forgive yourself too. So another thing, a very common thing, is that people are often frightened by conflict, where they become frightened by conflict or angry people or authority figures even. And so what we see is oftentimes angry people become mean and abusive. And so that often translates into physical or sexual or psychological abuse, which means there's no safe space to express emotions, right? So what happens is they look to avoid conflict at all costs, because if I were to actually express to my parents how their alcoholism made me feel, it would create conflict and uncertainty and potentially result in abuse for me. And so what do we see? They find it hard to confront parents about what's bothering them, so they learn to self-silence. And for those of you who listened to our attachment podcast, if you remember going back to that, I talked about there's 2 basic needs, the need for attachment and the need to be authentic. Remember? And authenticity was that space where you start expressing your voices and opinions. But what happens when your opinions and truths about the world start to conflict with your attachment figures? So now the need for authenticity threatens what you need to survive. Well, what gets shut down is we stop being authentic and we learn to just survive. And so this is exactly that paradox that starts to develop. I can't express myself honestly, so I'm just going to be quiet. And I start to silence myself, and I don't share my opinions. I don't get in touch with my feelings. I don't think about goals or long-term or future. I just think about surviving the here and now.
And then that creates its own cascade of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can fall into some of these maybe negative relationships or fall into your own behavioral or substance addictions because of that, right? You're like, nobody gets it. I can't talk to anybody. Like, I can't express myself. Like, doesn't matter. And then you just, that is such a strange connection.
It is.
I never really thought, I mean, I obviously thought of it, but like, it just really fully clicked today
Mhm.
about how like that impact of that one person like can affect everybody in the family, because there's so many times where you're like, oh my gosh, how is everybody in this family like that, or how do we see these issues like continue, and how, if your brother was an alcoholic, how are you now, like you saw what that did, and it's
Mhm.
like, well, kind of like makes sense why
Mhm.
it would happen, because of all of these reasons.
Yeah. Another thing, fear of abandonment. This is a big one for a lot of people. Fear of abandonment. This is one where it's actually difficult to get people sometimes to understand this, because what I'll hear is, no, they were always there. And I'm like, okay, abandonment doesn't always mean like leaving you on the doorstep of a firehouse. It means if the person may not physically be there, but what I'm talking about is their emotional unavailability. If they're emotionally unavailable, then you're always left alone because there's no one for you to connect with. There's no one for you to share things with. And so as adults, we find ourselves oftentimes in bad relationships, and we struggle to leave a bad relationship because at the end of the day, we just don't want to be alone. And the idea of that abandonment piece stems from that relationship, oftentimes from that, the fear of that person not being there for us, even though because they were never there for us, either physically or emotionally. That's a pattern that we repeat. And so we find other people who are like oftentimes emotionally unavailable to us, be it for one reason or another, and we kind of create that cycle again.
And you probably also, again, can't recognize like if somebody is emotionally available. You're like, what's this? Like,
Right.
This feels a little weird. This feels off. Something's wrong with them.
Yeah.
Like you self-sabotage almost that situation. Like this person seems great, but I'm used to this.
It can feel weird and icky when somebody's like, I'm sorry, how did that make you feel? And you're like, you want to know my feelings? And then what you get is this.
Hide.
You'll get this. Oh, I'm fine.
This
is fine. It's okay. Like, okay, I'm going to take away fine and good, right?
All worries.
I want you to use actual feeling words. And so it does. And what you find is it throws people into a vulnerable space.
Yeah.
So all of that starts to happen. Another thing that can happen is they can develop like a hyper sense of responsibility and just become like a perfectionist.
Because you feel like you have to take care of somebody, like because you always took care of that person.
Yeah.
Right.
Or like you were saying earlier too, so on one end of the spectrum, they can become like super responsible and perfectionist. And then, or the opposite can happen and they become like completely irresponsible. And so the reason is this.
It's so weird how that happens. I feel like this happens with everything. Like,
it can.
Like, not everything, but a lot of times, like, like I've had friends, come from like really bad, like just bad families, like bad socioeconomic background, et cetera, right? And like it's them and a sibling. And like they go one way and the sibling goes the other way. And they're like, I never want to be in this situation ever again. Like my parents were poor. I don't want to be poor. My parents are drug addicts. I don't want to do that. And then you become ultra successful and, not a drug addict, all these things, right? Like you become a whole conscious person. But then your sibling was like, yeah, this was all fucked up, but I'm going to go do this exact same thing. And I feel like there's like rarely like an in-between from like when somebody starts in like a bad situation like that, like you just really don't ever hear about that. You either hear about like, oh, they're just like so-and-so. Oh, you're just like your dad. You're just like your mom. Or you completely got out and are a totally different person and the family doesn't even really recognize you and probably treats you like shit because of it. And I've known many people in that situation, which is so comical and sad. Yeah. But you're just like, you're mad that somebody like got out of this. I mean, they're just obviously jealous, but yeah. Yeah,
and a large part of why that occurs, the disparity, is how that person interpreted and perceived the experiences. So like, for example, some children will face harsh criticisms from their parents. And so because of that, they try to avoid the hurtful words, and they do that by becoming a workaholic. They do that becoming an overachiever. They do that by taking responsibility and blaming themselves for things that are out of their control even. And so that's a way to avoid the criticism, versus the other person who interpreted differently and becomes more irresponsible and starts giving up because they're trying to be perfect. And here's the point. Soon they recognize that they can't and aren't perfect. And once they make that realization, they know that they will never be accepted or become enough. And so they just give up. And that's where they go down the other path. And so why does that happen? It's just about, it's a couple of things. It's how they perceived the events, their inner resiliency, and the other intangible factors that we can't measure, who are the people in their life that are keeping them on track. And so it's like, if you can be empathetic enough to put yourself in that person's shoes or to see yourself in that decision, you start to develop a little bit more empathy for the person who's struggling. And one of the last things, and this is a big one, is people oftentimes can find themselves attracted to excitement, and they want to save people. And this is the rescuer complex. Oftentimes they start to confuse love with pity, right? And we kind of see that play out, and they become attracted to excitement because they're used to experiencing unpredictable, chaotic events. And so it's confusing, and they confuse instability for passion. And they're oftentimes attracted to cold or emotionally unavailable people as a way to solve the problem or rescue them. And this is where kind of that savior-rescuer complex comes out of, because what they're really looking for is to be desired, and they want to be wanted. And so
I feel like you probably see that a lot.
Yeah, I see it a ton. A ton. And so I really kind of want to start to address some of the meat and potatoes of that question.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I feel like that was a really good overview. And again, we wanted to answer this question, but put it in a lens that can be applicable to obviously not just alcoholism, but in general, any kind of behavioral or substance addiction. And I think that really covered it. Yeah.
So obviously with any of these questions, I always feel the need to preface this in the sense of, I love the question, but because I'm unable to have an honest dialogue with the person, I have to make some assumptions. So all of this comes from a space where I can do my best with this. It's not something that a person should ever take as hard and fast advice or guidance or what to do. I'm just trying to give the best objective look at this question that I can. And so I feel the need to preface all of these questions with that stuff.
I understand. I think people understand that, but also, hey.
Right. So one of the things.
Take my advice or no. But
yeah, right.
Hope it works out.
Yeah.
We tried.
I show you that meme. It's like when you're an Italian, every time they give you advice, they throw their hands up in the air and they say, what the fuck do I know?
But really.
Right.
That's how we're going to
If it ruins your life, it's not my fault.
It's not Rick's fault. He's Italian.
Okay. So a couple of the things that I kind of picked out of this situation is length of time is kind of an issue within this, right? So 6 years on and off to me is a consistent and would qualify as a long period of time. So I guess one of the first elements I would want this person to start to think about is the concept of change itself. How long do you think it actually takes a person to change? Is change something that should occur often or immediately, rapidly? Is it something that you feel like should take a long period of time? Because how you view change and the progress toward change can greatly set the expectation for the other individual or the relationship. It's clear to me that this is a patient person. They've been around for 6 years. This is something that's been going on and off. They clearly love the person. Otherwise, I think they would have found a way out by now.
Especially since it's been 2 distant years also.
Yeah.
That's
to stay in contact for 2 long distance years is tough. Yeah. Especially when the relationship started, for 4 years they were together. That's even more difficult.
And things are kind of rocky right now, so it's even more difficult. This person definitely is patient.
Yeah.
And they're trying, and they care about this other individual.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I would ask and start to explore with this particular person is the other side of the coin is, what else is this other person doing to demonstrate commitment to the relationship, to you, to the future together? Because sometimes we can hyper focus on a problem and ignore every other aspect of the relationship. And it's like, well, is that fair to the other person? If we're just focusing on the one thing that you're doing wrong and ignoring everything else that might be really great about this relationship. But also what this does is it also starts to eliminate the other areas if they aren't doing those things. If you can't tell me what this person is doing to move forward in a healthy, productive way toward the relationship goals that you guys have set, it also starts to move the question, not just focus on addiction, but what I want and don't want in my relationship and what is missing. Because it might not just be the addiction piece that's missing. that might be just the piece I'm focusing on, and I might be missing a whole bunch of other things, which might help make the decision more clear, or might help them reframe it and be like, I'm only focusing on addiction and I've ignored all this other great stuff. So I don't know. That would be something to explore with the client.
That sounds really, like how you said in the beginning, like, is this person functioning in all these other areas? And then you just have a different interpretation of what drinking too much is.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it? Or no, is this really like, this is getting pretty bad, but all these other areas are failing too,
Right.
and not moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And they're using that as kind of this crutch. So
yeah. One of the other things that she mentioned in this is verbal abuse. And of course, it is never okay to do that to somebody. And I don't know the extent or how the person is qualifying it. But what I liked about what she wrote is, or I don't know why I said she, sorry, we're not going down that road. This person determined for themselves that whatever their significant other is saying qualifies as verbal abuse to them. And so one question that I would have is, what is it that's keeping you in the relationship still after you've become aware of that fact? That now you know this person is being verbally abusive. What is keeping you there since you know that? Like, because most people, if you were to talk to them right now, if they're single, or even in a relationship, and you were to say, what's a deal breaker? Most people are going to say abuse. It's funny how we have these preconceived ideas, and then we get emotionally attached to somebody, and suddenly all this stuff starts to erode, and we start to see it's not black and white, it's gray, and my love for them, and all this other stuff starts to add.
You start to accept more.
You don't know.
This is no big deal.
Like the path to right and wrong seems to not exist anymore, and it becomes this really windy, dark road. And so I guess one of the things that I would say is, now that you've become aware of that, number one, what is keeping you in the relationship knowing that you're being verbally abused or have been verbally abused in the past? And then the other side of this is, and this might be a little uncomfortable, but is there a part of her that sees their person as the victim and they see themselves as the rescuer? Are you trying to save this person? One could make the argument that 6 years without real consistent change is a long time. And what are you holding on for? Like, what does change actually look like for you? First of all, would be another question to ask. And
also, how have you brought this up either, right?
Yeah.
Is this something that I keep bringing this up, and you feel like you're bringing it up?
She did say they even brought in a counselor at one point, and that this has been an ongoing thing. Well, so how many therapists do you need to go through?
That's true. No, I think I thought it meant like on one occasion. Maybe I misread that. Like, I thought it meant like one session.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think she says like
obviously you don't usually.
I know what you're saying. Like one session versus like
a
period of 6 months or something like that. Yeah.
So what qualifies as, hey, we've had a serious conversation about this, and not saying that this person hasn't, of course, but just as another like devil's advocate, like really considering, okay, like does this person actually am I using the right words to share with this person how upset I am, or am I just like nagging like, oh, I hate when you drink, and they're like, okay, cool, like I like it, right? Like how, what is the level of like bringing this up versus like, hey, here are all the things that this is affecting me, like, from mentally, our relationship, emotionally, all these different things. And is it just like, I really don't like when you do that. Okay. You could say that about a lot of things. I'm sure that your partner could say that to you about a lot of things that you do as well. So like, how serious have you made this? And not saying and downplaying that this person hasn't. But that's just another way to consider that maybe the way that you're communicating it potentially didn't give them that sense of urgency, because it might have just come across potentially not in a serious enough tone. I'm not sure if that serious is the right word, but it's going to work for now because I can't think of another word. So
I gathered from the way the question was written, and the assumption that I took was that it had been discussed seriously. And
anybody else listening who maybe thinks like maybe just go through and like really reflect on, all right, if somebody's not making a change, is there a way that I can present this differently?
Absolutely.
And not saying that's
a great tool for you to give people.
It might not be enough. Like you might be saying it 100 different ways, but that is one way.
Yes.
To potentially reevaluate things.
Yeah, you need to communicate in a way that the person's going to hear it. And if they're not hearing it, that's a problem. And sometimes that's not your problem. But you can, if you've done everything you can to express the message and the person's just not receiving it, then you still have a difficult decision to make. Some other things, I would start to ask if this relationship is really fulfilling that person. Do they feel equal? Because what I find a lot of times is this: when we slip into these unhealthy roles, which is very similar, it's like the Cartman drama triangle, or trauma triangle, which is persecutor, victim, rescuer, right? What I find is we slip onto this triangle, which is very common in this space, where we see the addict or the person struggling as kind of the victim, and our role is that of the rescuer. And so we want to save them. And in slipping into that role, we realize that we fail to recognize the inadequacies of the rest of the relationship sometimes. Like that this maybe really, like we become so focused on saving the person that we've neglected every other aspect of the relationship and what else matters, right? It's kind of like
even if you fix that,
what's
okay,
left?
cool, but
Right.
what the fuck else is going on
Do we
here?
have the kind of relationship that I really wanted? And do we have the same values? Are we moving in the same direction? And so that to me, it's an uncomfortable space, but do you feel like an equal in the relationship? Has there been a time in the relationship history that as much thought and effort and attention went into you, but maybe in another aspect of life? I don't know. That would be something I would want to explore. Like, is this just you being solely focused on them and ignoring the fact that they've put time and attention into you? Again, not minimizing the drinking problem, but there's also a balance here. Like, is there a part of you that might be a little unhealthier that we would want to address? Because at the end of the day, no matter who you are, you cannot control somebody else's behavior. So the one thing I can only focus on is, what are the decisions and the choices you're making? Why are you staying in this relationship? What are you getting out of this? Why are you accepting the things that you're accepting? What is it about this? And so that's the process of therapy, is helping you to explore it, create thoughts and ideas, and allow yourself more clarity, but ultimately the decision falls on you. And so those are things that I would start to ask. I would say, and this is another one, and I think when people are struggling with when do I go, when do I stay, I get people to try and think about it in these terms. Knowing a person can change is very different than a person actually changing. And inconsistency is still a message, right? If the person is trying to change, and oftentimes what I see when the motivation is coming externally, meaning from outside sources, my wife, my husband, somebody wants me to change, that's not as strong as an internal motivating factor where I want to change. I see it as a problem. This isn't something that I want. Case in point, I want you to go to the gym, but you don't want to go to the gym. How long is that going to last?
Not very long.
Not very long. Before you're like, fuck this, I'm not going, right? But I wanted it. It's important to me. But if it's not important to you, like, you're never going to make that a habit. You're never going to go and put the effort in to see the results. Like, it's just too hard. And so it's the same thing with this. And I think evaluating whether or not a person will actually change versus knowing a person will change is different.
What's like a good timeline? And I think that's part of the crux of the question, so there's no real answer. But say somebody has recognized, like, wow, this is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously this is really going to depend on the severity of whatever we're talking about, whether it is behavioral or substance or both or whatever. But so say somebody is, okay, hey, I'm ready to make changes. But obviously along the way, it's not going to be smooth. It's not like the alcoholic is to be like, oh, never had a drink again and good to go. Like, there's going to be some bumpy roads. There's going to be probably some slip ups, etc. If it's a behavioral thing, probably going to experience that, that issue at some point. So like, what though is like a good time course before it's like, hey, like I need to give this person grace to like change, but also like hold them accountable because they keep saying they want to change, but then they keep slipping up every few weeks or few months. Well, what the fuck?
I'm going to answer that to the best of my ability. And I'm going to say, what is your expectation for change? Does change occur often, rapidly, or immediately? Do you believe change takes time? Because your expectation of what change should look like determines what you feel is happening and your sense of satisfaction and fulfillment in that. And so some people will tell you, like, I want change immediately. And this is something you can change immediately. And it doesn't take 6 years to make that change.
Yeah.
And some people will tell you, like, no, they've been making changes. You said in this, like, that there's been periods and times where he takes a break and then comes back to it. So some would make the argument that, like, he's attempting to change. I'm assuming it's a he. whatever.
Keep slipping. Rick has this problem where I don't know how long I can.
When you guys write questions, tell me if you're a woman or a man, please. It helps me so much.
I don't know if I should accept this level of change. I feel like this should be pretty immediate, but I guess
I'm
not.
I'm trying.
This is really why I was asking. I was like,
And so, again, one person's ceiling is another person's floor. One person will say 2 weeks, I'm out. Another person will say 6 months, I'm out. Somebody else will say 6 years and I'm out. Another person will be like, I'm never out. Like, this is forever for me, and I'm accepting that. As long as they keep trying, and they can measure progress 1,000 different ways. But it's a personal choice.
This is pretty not super cut and dry, but for somebody who's dealt with some type of substance abuse, it's probably like 0 is the number that we're reaching for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the person who's dealt with this really can't usually have a beer or two. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Yes.
So that's a little bit more clear cut. Whereas like behavioral things or personality things are generally probably a little bit harder, right? Because you've probably lived and developed that your whole life. If you're somebody who's like, hey, like, your partner's like, you being so neurotic and anxious all the time is like a total deal breaker. Like, we really need to work on that. Mm-hmm. But you're 30 or 40, whatever, like at some point you've developed this over your life. Like, that's not just going to be like, you're never going to not have anxiety anymore, right? You're never not going to be neurotic, but like, at what scale are we talking about, right? So I feel like that's going to be probably a lot more challenging.
Yeah.
Versus, an obvious substance would be like, we're going from this to probably 0. Like, most likely. I don't ever really hear of any person who's had a substance abuse issue who's like usually able to handle a little bit.
No,
it's really, really
by and large,
I'm sure
it's all or nothing.
But I've yet to meet anybody.
You either commit to recovery and understand that this isn't going to be a part of your life, and you make adjustments around that, or you're making excuses to continue to drink. For most people, like all of them. By most is what I mean. So, just a couple of other things before I kind of get into my final thoughts here. I would ask the person who wrote this, what are the individual's motivations for change? What's compelling them to seek alternative behaviors and seek therapy or change? What's compelling them to continue to make the same choices? Maybe that'll help you understand where they're coming from a little bit more. Again, if for those of you,
that's like an outlet for something, and it's like, hey,
it always is. Yeah. It always is. Addiction stems from a space of an inability to cope with something else in your life, and addiction became the coping mechanism for it. And then it becomes its own thing, sometimes a behavior, a pattern, but it stems from an inability to deal with something else from your life. And then what values exist or are present in the relationship for you? Do you believe that this is your role, or believe that it's your destiny perhaps to save this person? It's like kind of like your fate. Some people will hold on to that idea. Again, not saying if it's right or wrong, but that's an element of it. And, I would ask then, if you believe that it's your purpose in life to love this person no matter what's happening, then do you think it's okay for you to continue to sacrifice your goals, your desires, your wants and needs that come out of a relationship? Because to me, that seems very one-sided, and doesn't seem like you're going to get much out of the relationship because everything is 100% focused on the other person. And so it leaves you feeling very empty oftentimes, because again, once you fulfill this and the person changes, like, what's going to be in its place? And what are you going to focus on now that the problem's not there? Is it just like sunshine and rainbows? Because it's not going to be.
No.
I think we're lying to ourselves when we have that expectation.
Yeah. Oh, when this changes, everything will be better. Mm-hmm. It's like that part will be better. Like, you won't have to deal with the side effects of drinking anymore. Mm-hmm. But what else is now going to take its place? Because there has to be something that takes its place, right? Like, you're not just going to like quit a drinking habit and just be like, I'm really content. Yeah. Like, it's just not happening.
You're going to replace it with something.
With something. And it could be something even more detrimental, or it could be something really positive. Mm-hmm. But that's also a gamble.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the things that I want people to understand is, when it comes to relationships, you have to choose your heart. Leaving and starting over is hard. Staying is hard. I don't know if there's a way around it. There is no perfect solution, and there's no way to circumvent that. You've got to choose your heart, and it's going to come with sacrifices and pain, but that's a choice that we have to make. I did write this one last piece that I just want to read as kind of like my final thoughts, so to speak, to the person who wrote this question. And so if you guys will bear with me here, I want to get through this just to kind of send a final message to this person to hopefully kind of wrap things up and summarize this question. I guess what I want to say is, as I was reading this, my heart is breaking for you right now. I feel such sadness and desperation in your words. It's the struggle sometimes of knowing and feeling how deeply we can care for someone and love someone, but also being painfully aware of the truth, which is that despite our love for them, that we aren't enough for that person to change. Many times it's our need and desire to be accepted and to believe that we're finally enough that keeps us in an unhealthy relationship. We want to believe that if I love you hard enough, or for long enough, or if I stay this course and endure enough, that you will finally change and appreciate and cherish me. I will finally see that all of my pain and suffering won't have been in vain, and that this will all have served a much bigger purpose. I will have found meaning in this suffering, and in the end, we will move on in life together. I wish I could answer the question for you. When is it time to give up? I wish for your sake that you could be certain about which path to take. But I cannot help you find certainty about an uncertain future. Hindsight is always 20/20. I can't tell you or predict the future. Only in time you will know if you made the best decision for you. And only you can make the decision to stay or go. What I can tell you is to surround yourself with your friends and family and share this with them. Addiction and family struggles often exist in the dark and are kept in the dark. We hide the truth from everyone out of shame and fear and embarrassment. I want to tell you personally that there is nothing shameful or embarrassing about loving someone. The person you love now isn't all bad, and I'm quite certain there are many redeemable qualities within them. And it's this paradox that makes this choice so difficult. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to bring this struggle to light. Tell those who support you about your feelings and take comfort in their love and embrace their help. Many will tell you what you should think or what you should do, but no one else has to live with the consequences of your choice. You are strong and a worthy individual. The proof of that is after 6 years of therapy, or 6 years together, therapy, major life changes, countless arguments and disappointments, you're still looking for hope. That's a rare and unique quality. A quality that I hope one day you will cherish about yourself. Regardless of your choice to stay or go, I hope that you are eventually able to find peace within yourself. And so that's the only way I think I can summarize this for that client, or whoever this person is that your choice isn't going to be easy. It's going to be hard, and you will doubt it 100% of the way, and that's normal, but it's your choice to make. No one else can make it for you. And so my heart kind of breaks for this person because I know the dilemma, and I assure you that there are a lot of people, many people who have been in very similar situations who don't know whether to stay or go. And so this is a struggle that we can all relate to. So whoever wrote this, thank you for sharing it and letting us be a part of that. And I hope that this helped you or anybody else listening. So
Yeah, I think that was a perfect way to summarize it and to end it. I'm not going to say anything else to maybe mess up that outro. So if you guys are interested in working with Rick, we'll put his information below in the show notes. And if you like this week's episode, please share it. This is the best way you can support our show. To check out our coaching services, courses we offer, and additional content we put out, visit teamlocofit.com. Follow us on Instagram @teamlocofit, and we will talk to you guys next week.